Thank you. This has been just a fantastic conversation. I'm looking forward to continuing it a little bit. I want to just remind, for those of you who haven't actually taken the time to read the entire book, it is just as funny as Thomas was up here at the podium, and so I strongly recommend it. I found myself guffawing like every 4 or 5 pages, so I recommend it on that. So I want to talk about two things, what the implications are if he's right, and where we should start looking for some policy answers. And on some level, I felt after finishing the book about the same way that I feel about issues around climate change, which is that there's a lot of people that have put together a lot of data and evidence that points to a particular conclusion, and I think we should just go with that and assume it's right. And now we need to, I understand we do need to keep digging into it. That is a little bit just to give you my bias from the get-go. As I've been talking about this book for the past few months in Washington to policymakers and to advocates, I find myself coming back to what I think is one of the most important takeaways for people who want to understand what it means. And that is that Thomas and his many co-authors, co-authors for all of this data, the data tells us one thing that I think is critical, which is that as we see income inequality rise, this calcifies into wealth inequality. And that has critical economic and social implications. And as I've been doing work in Washington for a long time, and there seems like there's been people over here that do wealth inequality, and there's people that over here that did income inequality, but putting those together, I think, in many ways is part of the genius of this in terms of, I think, making an impact. So where does that lead me in terms of what does it mean? Throughout the book, Thomas points his readers to the novels of Jane Austen, Henry James, Henri Balzac, and I want to quote him. He says, quote, "For Jane Austen's heroes, the question of work did not arise. All that mattered was the size of one's fortune, whether acquired through inheritance or marriage." Now, I've only read one Henry James novel because I didn't like it and I never read another one, but I read a lot of Jane Austen, and every time I did, it reminded me why I was so happy to have been born in 1970 and not in the early 1800s. These novels were a testament to the limited choices that women had. And while there's been a gender revolution, it remains fairly recent and for the most part incomplete. When I went off to college, my mother, as we were sort of looking at all of the college applications, I remember very vividly her telling me how jealous she was, with a little bit of a choking up, because she was so excited because I had so many more opportunities than she did. And I say this to stress that this revolution in gender equality just isn't that old. She felt that her only options were to be a nurse or a teacher or a secretary, and that of course were not the opportunities that I had in front of me, and of course are not the opportunities that today's young women have. These changes in opportunity were good for our economy. According to Stanford economist Peter Klenow and his colleagues, one of my favorite papers, I quote it all the time these days, the opening up of professions to women and minorities has accounted for a fifth of U.S. GDP between 1960 and 2008. That is a non-trivial number. In my own research with John Schmidt and Eileen Applebaum, we found that the increase in women's labor supply in the United States has added 11% to U.S. GDP since 1979. Now, all of us in this room today, and those of you online, if you are still watching, we have all lived through an era where the presumption was that our society is marching towards ever more greater equality across a variety of axes, and that we're doing away with discrimination. In fact, I had lunch with a journalist today who was sort of saying, yes, no, things are going to get better. I have this hope that, my children will experience greater inequality than me. And I said to her, well, if Thomas Piketty is right, we have to question whether or not this is coming to an end. And I think we need to take this very seriously. To get a feel for this, you could point to PBS's Downton Abbey, where the family was facing eviction because when the Earl died, the inheritance was going to some random cousin that they kept talking about. And there was no other way for the family to keep this property than for the eldest daughter to marry this cousin. I mean, this is not the world that we live in, and not the world that is going to create a vibrant economic economy. But it opens up new questions that maybe we should start thinking about, or maybe we will have to think about. Do inheritances go to the eldest child or to the eldest male child? What happens upon the death of a spouse? Does the wife or the child inherit these funds? The answers to these questions, I fear, will not be good for women, because while the gender revolution has come a long way, it is stalled in recent decades in important ways. Thomas's data makes me wonder if we will worry that because we have not solidified this revolution more rapidly. Women remain far behind men in terms of their wealth holdings. The female share of self-made billionaires is only 3.1%. While we've made progress in the workplace, the gender pay gap remains 78 cents on the dollar, and this gap begins as soon as women enter the labor force, and of course it grows over time. This gap occurs in no small part because, especially here in the United States, we have not addressed with the realities of work and care. In the vast majority of workplaces, neither women nor men, which is of critical importance, have access to paid family leave, except in a few states, California, New Jersey, and Rhode Island. And the lack of a federal paid family leave policy leaves women and caregivers disadvantaged in the labor market. We see the outcome of this in terms of a much lower female labor supply in the United States than other OECD countries. The United States has now fallen to 17 out of 22 OECD countries. So we know that policy can play a role in changing labor supply patterns. But if we are on the cusp of an era where wealth becomes more important, that failure may also be more important and more urgent to address. It also raises the question of the extent to which some of these labor supply policies that increase not population but do increase labor supply could go at least some of the way towards addressing some of the decline in economic growth, which is talked about so much in the book. We know that expanding opportunities to excluded groups raises productivity, so maybe there's a little bit of potential there. But this leads me to two aims for policymaking that I draw from the book. First, recognizing that women are an underutilized source of growth, and addressing this is extremely urgent and important for our economy, and may be imperative in order to not regress on the progress we've made. Now, Thomas called on non-economists to engage, and I couldn't agree more. In Japan, in order to boost growth in the face of declining population growth, they are pursuing what they call womenomics and implementing policies to boost female labor force participation and close the gender wage gap. When I talk to policy leaders from the United Kingdom or Canada, I'm often been really quite struck by these male policymakers will explain to me that addressing that the conflicts between work and family are actually critical for economic productivity, without me actually asking them to tell me that. Whereas I've never had just no single male U.S. policymaker ever make that argument unbidden. I'm looking forward to that day. That is actually my career goal. We'll see if I can do that. While I fear that Thomas's analysis predicts that women may have I fear that this will lead to fewer economic opportunities for women, I also have to wonder what it means to ponder an economy where dead capital could again supersede human capital. Certainly, it would imply less innovation if economic opportunities were confined to those who started the game with the most capital inherited or from accumulated capital. But, I also wonder if this is an overreaction. Now, in the book, and Thomas did have some chance to talk about this on the podium here, he focuses on the rise of the supermanager and talked a little bit about how that the rise of the supermanager, especially and most extremely in the U.S. case, and I wish you had shown that chart because I think that's so important for U.S. audiences to see, means that wages are, of course, not equal to their marginal product, and that there's something odd going on in terms of how we pay people and what those payments actually are. Which brings me to a second area for policy. I think we have to, one question that I had after reading the book, and one question that I think we need to be really considering, is what we are now calling labor income actually that? Is it capital income, or is it some form of economic rent? And how would we measure that? How do we get at this question? Thomas joked about how some of the data that he had on wealth is from Fortune magazine, and that's just quite frankly pathetic. But how would we get at understanding whether or not those earnings that supermanagers have are actually productive or unproductive? How could we pull together those kinds of data sets so that we could get at that question? My organization hosted a conference last week, and it was very kind of cool because Alan Blinder was in the audience, which was amazing, and he raised his hand and asked a question of Emmanuel Saez on this very point where they debated back and forth that we really don't have data that allows us to discern whether high incomes are rents or if they're actually productive. In order to do something about it, we need to know the answer to that question because we need to be able to make the argument to policymakers that going back, if we think that this is what we should do, going back to the kinds of tax regimes that Thomas put up on his last slide in figure 14.1 from the book, if we want to do that, the argument we need to make is that that will not be a complete and utter disaster for our economy. If I go around and start talking to policymakers about how we need to go back to very high tax rates, they're going to look at me and say that is a job-killing argument because those are the people that are the job creators and we're giving them all that money because they're creating all the jobs. But clearly the evidence that Thomas and his colleagues have put together indicates that that's not true. But I think there are a few more data steps that we need in order to make that argument. Which brings me finally, in terms of the policy, back to the wealth tax idea, which I think is very interesting. And we've had a lot of conversations with colleagues about the proposals in the book on taxing wealth, which I think are very interesting. It also seems incredibly hard. And so a former colleague of mine, Michael Ettlinger, talked about this at our conference last week and made the point that, wealth is not only harder to track, but it's harder to value. It's very complicated, and we don't have the data. And I hear your call for more data on that. I think that is very important. But I think we also need to be striving for interim steps that we can do in the short term to elevate how we also need to be taxing income as well, especially incomes at the top. So I want to end with a few notes, pivoting off of a few things that Anwar said about how I'm just so pleased that we are having this conversation today at the New School for Social Research. I'm so excited that you came here to give this talk. And I think it's encouraging and exciting to see economic research that begins by seeking to understand the real world and then uses that data to inform a theoretical framework. That is a very exciting development, and I was just so thrilled to see your book go to the top of the charts and be so reality-based. I think that's amazing. But I also want to point out that I think that Thomas is actually part of a new generation of economists who are asking different questions. He's not the only one that is using data to break down some of the theoretical traditions in the neoclassical model. I would point to Amir Sufi and Atif Mian, who've been doing really interesting work with microeconomic data, asking big macroeconomic questions, and many others. And I think some of this may have to do that many of us in this generation who came into adulthood as the 1980s turned into the 1990s, we began not from President Kennedy's dictum that a rising tide lifts all boats, but rather perhaps from the premise articulated by presidential economics advisor Gene Sperling that, quote, the rising tide will lift some boats, but others will run aground, end quote. We have had to begin our lives as economists with this kind of thinking, perhaps, or at least I have. The only economic reality we've ever experienced is one where productivity gains go to the top while leaving the vast majority to cope with stagnant wages, greater hours of work, and most especially in the past decades, rising debt burdens. We've experienced firsthand the damage this has done to our generation and to the ones that follow. We've lived through an economic crisis that the economics profession neither predicted or prevented, and quite frankly, in this country at least, and many others, still has not solved. So the idea that there's a new generation of economists who are asking different questions and looking at real-world data is incredibly exciting. The idea that the real world matters was a key idea that I took from my education here at the New School, and I'm glad we've been able to be here together today to discuss this. Thank you.
Professor Piketty, while my colleagues are collecting questions from the audience, and I will moderate those, would you like to respond to Heather and Anwar? Okay, great. You can just do it from the table there?
Yeah.
Sure.
No, just, I think it's better if we have more time for questions, but let me just say very quickly that I think what Heather said about the importance of gender equality and women participation is extremely important. I think in some countries it's clear that the pressure that's put on women to basically, withdraw from the labor force after they have children, as the consequence that, some countries are almost about to disappear. When you have the, when the size of the cohort in Japan or Korea or Germany or Italy, that the size of the generations that are born right now are 30% smaller than the generation of their parents. This is not the complete end of the country, but this is getting close. If you continue like this for 2 or 3 generations. And so, like all important social and economic issues, this is not a technical issue. This is really a conflict of what part of society is asking to women and what they actually don't want to deliver. And so the solution will come from more gender equality and from policies that help mothers and fathers to have the children they want to have and have the daycare system and the institution in societies that allow them to reconcile their professional aspiration and their educational role. So this is extremely important. I think these demographic issues are some of the deepest issue and challenge we have to face, and they have strong consequences also on inequality, because a society where you have a declining population is also a society where inherited wealth and inheritance becomes very important. And if you want to reduce inequality and make inheritance less important, you should have a lot of children, basically. So that's.
Oh, I get to do this. This is fun. Wait a second. Yeah, how about this? And this would be to any of the panelists. Maybe, Heather, you have some insight, but to you, Professor Piketty. Is there any information, anything that you came across that would give you an idea about what point inequality would foment social unrest and maybe lead to a transformation, maybe lead to progressive taxation? What's that level? And if you haven't found such a relationship, why not? Professor Piketty first.
Yeah, well, I'm afraid I don't have a mathematical formula to determine this level, but what I try to do in the book is to show that at least we can make progress by historical comparison and try to better understand the orders of magnitude where inequality becomes really excessive. So, for instance, the level of wealth concentration that we find in European countries until World War I was, I think, excessive in at least 2 ways. First, it was not useful for growth. Clearly, inequality was greatly reduced by World War I, the Great Depression, World War II, by a number of social policies that were enacted after the wars, and this did not reduce growth. If anything, this contributed to even higher growth in post-war decade. And also this very high level of inequality, I think, contributed to the inability of democratic European societies, where in principle, you had universal suffrage, at least for men, in 1910, 1914, but I think largely the political power was captured by wealthy elites, and this explained part of the reason why the political system was not responding to the very high inequality and very high social tension of the time. In France, income tax was adopted not to pay for schools, but to pay for the war in the summer of 1914, just 1 century ago. And this was the only time when the French Republican elite accepted to. So it's a very sad story where I think the high inequality went with the capture of the political process that prevented the right social reform and fiscal reform from happening. And this is something that, we don't want to return to that kind of situation, and there is growing concern, in particular in these countries, that when inequality is getting as high as it does today, it has, this is a real threat for our democratic institution and the ability of the democratic system to respond to this challenge that we have to respond. So, yeah, I think history can tell, can help us to realize when this is getting too high.
Well, let me just add one thing, which is I'm sure that you would not say this, Piketty, but Thomas Piketty, but it was your work with Emmanuel Saez that we saw in banners all over the United States in the Occupy Wall Street movement about the we are the 1% and the 99% numbers. For me, watching that happen and realizing the first time I saw that, I was like, where have I seen that before? And realizing it was from a quarterly Journal of Economics paper and wondering like how that had sort of made its way to some crazy activist, which was very interesting to see. I mean, I think that I think the question is interesting, Teresa, but it's also, I think, underscores the importance of data that helps encapsulate what the real-world experiences people are having out there that is the role of us as economists to be finding. But it's amazing, to then see actual activist groups pick that up and run with it and do with it what they will. But I will just sort of note that this work has already sort of sparked some social movements here.
Let me add a couple of points here. We've been talking mostly about the developed world, but there is a huge level of inequality across the developing world. And one of the astonishing things is that it's tolerated for long periods of time. And that what breaks it up is not so much that, but the joining of that with the issue of employment. If jobs are not there, then it becomes much more volatile. And of course, the political structure. I was once taken on a tour in China of a museum in which they would go from one dynasty to another, and I noticed that there were breaks in the time between dynasties, and they were not mentioned in there. So I asked my guide, what is that? He said, oh, the peasants overthrew the dynasty and killed everybody, and then a couple hundred years later. So there's your answer. We need more peasants of that sort.
Here's a question about the form of tax. Would a tax on land or rent control or a tax on carbon, would that have the same effect as a progressive income tax of 90% marginal tax rate?
No, these are all different taxes. They can all be useful. They are all complementary. You know, a carbon tax is, of course, has a very specific purpose, which is to reduce carbon emission. Yeah. And ideally, if the carbon tax works, there will be no tax revenue anymore, or very little tax revenue. Right. So that's not. This has a very, very specific purpose. And so I think we need both, that kind of carbon tax. We need both progressive income tax and a progressive wealth tax. This is serving different purpose. The land tax, that's part, in my view, this should be part of a wealth tax. Yeah. So land is part of wealth, but, if you want to isolate land from other forms of wealth, I think this doesn't work because the land value from the building value. So in some cases, like this place, maybe you can separate the land component. Although, even the land component here depends a lot of the other investment and improvement that have been made to the surroundings and that make New York City. So it's difficult. The pure land value, it's a social construction. The price of land depends on a whole set of social institutions. And also you can own land and real estate through financial companies, through financial assets. So if you don't have a comprehensive wealth tax, some people are going to escape the tax by owning land and real estate through financial assets. So, the only reason why the current wealth tax in the US is the property tax. So it taxes real estate and land. The only reason why it doesn't tax financial assets is because this was created 2 centuries ago at a time where financial assets were not important. The issue is to transform our tax system to adapt it to the structure of wealth today. And I think it will, the simplest solution will be to replace the existing property tax by a progressive tax on net wealth, so that in effect the vast majority of the population will pay less tax. So all the people who have a large mortgage and who are trying to enter the game and who are trying to accumulate wealth will pay less tax. This will increase wealth mobility. And people with very large financial wealth will pay more tax. And I think we will come to that one day. This will take time, but I think this is common sense at some level.
Well, let's advance the vision of what that's in your book, the very optimistic part of your book. And that's all three of you talk about the pathway between a progressive wealth tax, that would mean most of us would pay less tax, and social mobility. What's the linkage between that revenue gain and your hope for an innovative, mobile society? First you, Professor.
Well, the first link is that if you reduce the tax that's paid by the bottom groups in society, and for that matter, the bottom 90%, it makes it easier to accumulate wealth. The link is also that if you reduce top managerial compensation, this will help to increase other wages. So I think, a big part of the wage gains have been appropriated by the top, and, you could have bigger increase in wages for middle groups and bottom groups if you were to limit top managerial compensation by higher tax rate at the very top, and together with increase in the federal minimum wage. The federal minimum wage right now has a purchasing power that is less than what it was in the 1960s. Which is, 50 years ago. And, it's quite unusual for a country to have a decline in the purchasing power of its minimum wage in over half a century. And although
We stand apart from that, right? In your book shows that.
Well, yeah, it's very striking, and so I think it's possible to increase it quite substantially without increasing unemployment. Unemployment was not higher in the 60s, although the real value of the minimum wage was higher than it is now. So now in the long run, of course, it's easier to have a higher minimum wage if you have also higher investment in education, higher investment in skills, so that bottom workers can have access to higher productivity jobs and higher. So it's all complementary. Progressive taxation, higher minimum wage, and higher public investment in education. I think are the three key policies that need to go together. We don't want to choose; they are complementary.
Heather, do you agree those are the key policies?
Certainly. I think I want to emphasize one thing that has been said that I think is really important, that it's, so often when we think about inequality and we think about both the taxes and the revenue and what we're going to do about it, so often we think about, well, here's the policies that we're going to do for people and how much they cost, and that's really where all the action is. But I think this conversation really pushes us to say, oh, well, actually, you're not just taxing folks at the top in a progressive way to punish them, but that a progressive tax system is actually more functional in many ways for the economy. And I think that's a really important thing to keep bearing in mind. If these very high incomes that folks at the top are earning are not indeed productive, but are some form of rent or extraction, or they're coming at the expense of middle income workers getting higher wages, which then is correlated with what's going on in terms of stable consumption patterns, or has an effect on what kinds of investments they can make in the next generation, that there's cost to all of that. I think 15 or 20 years ago, there was a conception that it's okay, inequality is just fine, we don't really need to deal with it in terms of policy, because just because somebody's getting rich doesn't mean that somebody's actually losing. The pie just keeps getting bigger. But even if the pie is getting a little bit bigger, addressing how this skew is not focusing the nation state, our nation's economic resources on activities that would further economic productivity and economic stability. If you sort of think about the Great Recession being driven by the way that families took on too much debt and how that was concentrated among low net worth households, one could only imagine if households were getting the kinds of wage gains that we would like them to be getting, because you'd been doing something where you were taxing more at the top and they were using that money instead to give each other higher wages. They were actually just paying people more, and so you had wages more aligned with productivity, that would have had an effect on how much people might have been borrowing. I mean, who knows? But I think connecting those dots is really important. So thinking about the policy not just in terms of the punishment or what that particular tax revenue might buy us, but how that affects how our economy functions.
I wanted to add a voice on that, because I agree with Heather that the key issue is that we have to not just talk about the distribution, but at the what I call the secondary level, which is the taxes and so on, but at the primary level. And that's very important. If you look in the history of taxes on land, Henry George argued very, very persuasively that unused land should be taxed, and his views became extremely influential across the United States, where he was, in Europe, and it became the basis of a land tax, which forced many people holding large estates to disgorge them. We know now all kinds of poor counts and dukes in Europe who have to work for a living. And this, it did, no, from their point of view it is, and that's a very important issue. This led, as Thomas points out, to other forms of assets and wealth, and we are now focusing on the generality of assets and wealth, but the fact is that the underlying distribution has a lot to do with the extent of inequality, and that's something that we have to put up front, the distribution by class, by gender, by race, ethnicity. In most parts of the world, these bite much harder than the question of taxation and transfers.
Yeah.
We don't all live in Sweden, and that's an important thing to understand.
Oh, it's a fascinating counterintuitive finding that raising taxes would actually raise the wages of people in the middle class, and then also that's coupled with a direct policy that's aligned with the rest of Europe to raise the minimum wage, that you actually have a pathway between progressive income taxes and raising the wages for most people, which Heather points out actually may have reduced some of the indebtedness and therefore stabilize the financial crisis. That's a fascinating connections. We have questions, a couple of questions here, and you mentioned it a bit in your book, which is tying the growth of inequality to the increasing constraint on the planet for economic growth. Can you actually draw arrows between curbing the inequality of wealth and income and actually creating a sustainable planet?
Right. So, in the last chapter of the book, I try to explain that these issues about financial transparency, public debt, may seem very difficult to solve, but in fact they are very simple problems to solve as compared to the real problems of global warming and threat to our natural capital, which we should be much more concerned about, because the public debt, after all, it is just a debt against ourselves. It is just this can be changed. We just have to change what's written in the book, and it will. There's nothing, and there are lots of experience in the past where we had public debt even bigger than that, 200% of GDP in 1945 in France and Germany. And in 1950 it was zero because we had decided that it would be zero, and so there was inflation, there was debt repudiation, and of course this did not prevent future economic growth, quite the opposite.
Yeah.
So it's, whereas when you have 3 more degrees on the planet, that's more difficult to get rid of it just through inflation, So we should, the worst thing about the inequality and problem and financial opacity problem is that this makes it more difficult this takes all our energy, and this makes it more difficult to solve the other problems. So I think it's important, that we make progress both on the inequality front, so that we can also move to the more important front, which is the environment and the long-run sustainability of growth. It's very difficult to ask normal people to make effort on the environment, by paying more tax on carbon tax or oil tax, etc. If people have the feeling that the high wealth people, large multinationals, are not paying tax at all. So it's very, these problems, in order to be solved, need more financial transparency, need more democratic transparency about income and wealth. And as we were saying earlier, that's even more true in poorer countries, in emerging countries, than in rich countries, where a lot of the wealth is often exiting the country because of the lack of financial cooperations to fight tax havens and to get to a more transparent international tax system. Now, the good news is that I think we can make progress. I think if we put the right sanctions on tax havens, we are about to have a big negotiation between the United States and the European Union for a new trade treaty. I think it will be a mistake to have only trade liberalization into this treaty. We are putting half of the world GDP around the table, about 1/4 of world GDP for the US, about 1/4 for the European Union. So this is not a global government, but this is still half of the world GDP. And this is a unique opportunity to try to bring more fiscal justice into globalization with a minimal tax on multinational corporations, a global registry of financial assets. And, if we don't put strong fiscal, social, environmental regulation into such an agreement, I think there's a strong probability that our public opinion, both in the US and in Europe, will not be happy with just another round of trade liberalization. So, we have to take these opportunities to make progress.
So if I could add something to that, I think on your question about the climate change and where we are in terms of politics, it made me think about how we have a lot of evidence here in the United States that today's high income inequality is associated with political outcomes that favor those who have most of the money. And I think that, it's something we don't think about enough with climate change, but there's some research, and I apologize to whoever the author is because I'm just blanking on the name. I wasn't thinking about it before but at any rate, showing that if a policy is not favored by the wealthy, it doesn't get put into action. So it could be that, that policies that, so there's clapping for that. That's not a good thing, maybe. I don't know. Maybe that was a like on Facebook, when you actually don't like it, but all right. I digress. But I think that, when we think about climate change and who is impacted, we know that the effects are disproportionately felt by low-income families and in certain communities. There was an article in today's paper about people in a community in California living in, who own their land but live in mobile homes who don't have any water. And you're reading this, this is a climate change story, but they have no options. They can't sell their land and nobody's going to help them. And so you're seeing these effects that are being sort of concentrated among people also have the least political power. So while climate change affects us all, those at the very top have ways of mitigating that a little bit to their own benefit and may not feel the same exact measure of urgency. Certainly we're seeing that play itself out through our politics. But I do think it's important to understand, I don't know if other questions want to focus on the intersection between today's high income inequality in the United States and how that is playing itself out and what evidence we have on that.
Right.
Yeah, I want to add that really, when we talk about the benefits the economy as a whole, we're really telling a lie because, of course, some people win and some people lose. You're not going to persuade the Koch brothers that higher wages and higher taxes on profit, because they know perfectly well that that's not in their interest. So if we want to talk about democracy and democratic capitalism, we have to understand that it is a system of conflict wrapped in compromise. And the compromise has to come about by recognizing that some losses are socially justified, even though they are losses, and you can't speak of them as just as gains. That becomes even more important when you go outside of the developed world, where you're talking about very serious transfers involved if we're going to talk about any serious development. So I'm all in favor of arguing that it's good for the majority of the people, which is an older phrase, than for the economy as a whole.
Well, I do agree that your book, Professor Piketty, and all of us who have worked on inequality and wealth and income have really fueled the momentum to these tax regime conversations. And Apple plaintively saying, I didn't break the law when I moved to Ireland and didn't. They're on the defensive, and I think we can take credit for that. And also, the numbers that you and Saez developed for the United States became placards and T-shirts, in the Occupy movement. So that's very optimistic that numbers matter in terms of people's imagination. I'm would like to turn to what Anwar just talked about, and that conflict and change is, that change comes from conflict, maybe fueled by data, but the conflict has to be there. And you said in an interview that if you had to redo the book again, and maybe imagine the conversations you've had, that you would have talked more about labor unions and how their rise and fall has affected your graphs that rise and fall. Would you like to take the moment here and expand upon that?
Yes, no, I guess it played a more important role in my mind than in my writing. In my writing, I do talk about the labor movement, but probably I do not, given the length of the book, I should have emphasized more that, this was, of course, part of the new institutional setup that made the post-war period possible. And, it's very, and more generally, the labor movement and the pressure that was brought also by the existence of a counter model with the communist model, put a strong pressure on capital owners in Western countries, which completely changed the attitudes toward a number of social and fiscal reforms that were previously refused. And you can see in the 1920s in many European countries, a big part of the elite starting to accept fiscal changes and social changes, which in 1914 were impossible, and in between, the Bolshevik Revolution and has completely changed the view of what we should accept or not, because people realize that after all, progressive taxation is less dangerous than straight expropriation, and so this, the entire history of inequality is made of struggles and revolutions and play a role. Labor unions play a very large role. So it's now today, with the decline of manufacturing and employment, and it's clear that labor unions, in recent decades, did not play the role in wage bargaining in a number of countries, in particular in Europe, that they used to play up until the 70s or even 80s, and probably that's the reason why some countries that didn't have national minimum wages until recently actually developed national minimum wages, like Germany or Britain. But now I don't think that's going to be enough. I think we still need collective bargaining institutions, and just national legislation is never going to replace this.
Yeah, Heather.
I'm glad that was good to hear. That's great. I think actually I will just make one note. I mean, I think that was great to hear. But I think that one of the things when we talk about inequality, I'm often just amazed at how the conversation is about poor, or maybe folks at the very, very top. And I mean, really, when you look at what's happened in the United States, I mean, the numbers that you and Sayez put together, where you look at the top 1%, that is critically important. But understanding how that has been associated with a squeezing of the middle, and sort of people being pushed out, mostly to the bottom, a few to the top, is really a big piece of the story, and it both affects the politics, but it also affects the economics, I think, in very important ways. So I think unions. I mean, minimum wages are great, but that's way down here. Unions really were about folks in the middle and making sure that you had all the things that they did in terms of wages, but also on-the-job productivity.
Anwar, here's your chance to talk more about conflict.
Yes, but I actually want to talk about another element, which I think is, I have been working for 15 years on a book, which I just finished, and the central theme of that book is that capitalism is driven by profitability most of all. Businesses depend on profitability, and that profitability provides wages and rents and interest and all that. So it's very important to focus on that. And what's the relevance of that? Insofar as we're talking about policies, talking about benefiting people as a whole, we have to recognize that this may have limits insofar as has a negative impact on profitability. So it's not just the individual people like the Koch brothers, who are, maybe our opposition candidate for this kind of discourse, but really about the fact that in capitalist economy runs on profit. And so here's the punchline of that. Increasing wages is entirely possible, but if it's not going to have a negative impact, it must be attended to with increasing productivity. It's what I call the Swedish solution. And Swedes raise wages tremendously, but they also raise productivity. In a modern era, in the time of crisis, that's a different discussion, because you can't do both. But over the long run, I believe it's possible to show that that the dynamic of the system is fundamentally constrained and shaped by the dynamic of capital, and capital dynamic depends on profitability. So that's why I put so much emphasis on the wage share argument in my book also, because it's a very crucial issue. It determines the profit share, and the profit share with technical change determines the profit rate, and that drives the system.
Now our final question, which John Kenneth Galbraith said that phrase gives hope to the audience. And this reflects the multi-generations here in the audience. It doesn't happen that often. We have young students and old professors in the audience. And this question is about something that you've also mentioned in your book. It was almost a warning that with all this talk about inequality at various levels, there is a political economy narrative that threatens to supplant this conversation, and that's the narrative of intergenerational inequity, that the real problem is that the old are taking away from the young. Would you all like to comment on that narrative and that reality, if it's real? It's real, I hear. Is it real? Is that what's going on? Professor Piketty.
I think the intra-generational inequality have always been and will always probably be more important than this intergenerational conflict. I think it's important to realize that when we talk about inequality of wealth, it's almost as big within each age group than for the entire population as a whole. So, if you take the population as a whole in the US, the bottom 50% owns like 2% of total wealth. The next 40% own 22%, and the top 10 own the rest, so 75%. Now, this is quite striking. Now, if you look within each age group, it will be not very different. The bottom 50 would have maybe 5%. If you look within the people who are 50-year-old, or within people who are 30-year-old, and the middle 40 would own maybe 25 or as much as 30. Amazing. So it's and the top 10 would still own 70 instead of 75 or 65 instead of 70. So it's a bit less concentrated, but basically the level of inequality remains the same. So it's very important to know, because you have indeed this very ideological discourse about how life cycle wealth accumulation has entirely replaced dynastic wealth inequality and inequality within each generation. But in fact, it's not the case. This is a fairy tale. This is, this idea that now, everybody is poor and then rich as you get older, and then poor again when you die because you have eaten up your wealth during your pension. That's a theoretical model, but if you look at the data, that's really a limited part of what wealth distribution and accumulation is all about.
Heather and Anwar?
So one thing that we see when we look at the U.S. data in terms of generational change is that proceeding, as we move across cohorts, you see actually that the absolute level of income and wealth has been falling for generations. So the Gen Xers, and then the millennials behind them, and the Gen Y, and then the millennials, and then behind them are all seeing lower starting salaries and greater levels of debt in general. And when you think about that, I think that is very worrying. So I think your point in terms of the relative may be true, but my understanding of the absolute is that it's down, but it certainly is also increased in terms of the debt loads, which is something that we've been talking a lot about in terms of especially student debt in Washington over the past couple of years. I think that one of the things that when you look out at the way that we support families, we have a set of social policies that were, for the most part, in the U.S. case, designed for the way that families looked in a traditional sense in the 1930s. We've had some adjustments over time, but for the most part, the infrastructure that we have that supports families and that provides our basic labor standards is still ensconced in the Fair Labor Standards Act and the Social Security Act, wonderful pieces of legislation. But when families looked very differently than they do today, and when I say families looked very differently, primarily what I'm talking about is the way that people are raising the next generation. So you're talking about young families. So anytime you're thinking about the changes in how households are looking, you are essentially talking about changes across generations. So when you look today at families with children in the home, it used to be in the 1960s, of course, you had, a stay-at-home mom and a dad, and that was about 60% of families. And today, if you were to, sort of map that out, you see a wide array of different kinds of families with different work patterns, with different numbers of parents, more kids living with grandparents, and all sorts of crazy things, and we don't have a policy infrastructure that supports it. I say all this in a very long-winded way to say that when you're thinking about the intergenerational conflict, families are getting very little from their government when they are younger. They have very expensive schools. They're not getting support when they have children, when they're at the low end of their earning. They are looking at jobs that are with unpredictable schedules. They don't get jobs and keep them. They don't have pensions. The whole world has shifted for them, and I think that we are not having the conversations that we need to have to actually address any of those realities. And then we wonder why young people say that they don't think that government works for them. And I think we need to, I would encourage it. So I don't think that it is necessarily a generational battle, but I do think that the way that inequality is played out and the lack of attention to that does mean that there have been generational impacts.
I would point to something that we haven't mentioned yet, which is actually in Thomas's book, which is the tremendous drop in the population growth rate. He mentioned that in passing. There's a wonderful graph, you see it going down, heading towards zero. Well, that will naturally shift the balance between young people and old people, especially given that medicine allows us old people, hopefully, to live longer. But yet the paradox is, in the modern world, is that despite the fact that the population of young people is growing more slowly, the unemployment among young people has grown dramatically. And that is not a natural consequence. It's a consequence of the crisis and also of the fact that mechanization has actually accelerated rather than slowed down, despite the fact that workers are cheaper, because globalization has also spread mechanization all across the globe. Again, I believe that these are sort of intrinsic native properties in the same sense that Thomas believes in inequality tendency as a native property, but I don't mean by that they're ineluctable. In the same sense that Thomas says, these are properties that can be offset, but they require attention and focus, and they require, to come back to Teresa's question, conflict.
Yes.
Thank you very much for the conversation. Thank you for coming.